Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached a Monday. Today is the 8th day of June in the year 2015, and it is a pleasure to be back with you here at the Virtual Center Live. As those of you who regularly listen know, it was 1 week ago today was the last live broadcast that we did. We were unable to present programs Tuesday and Wednesday because of production issues, and so we had announced last Monday that we would not be doing a program again until today. So today it's been 7 days, full week since we last got together here at the Virtual Center, and I want you to realize how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and how much I appreciate your willingness to tune in and stay with us through these programs as we touch on a number of issues. I would like to invite each and every one of you to feel comfortable and avail yourself of the opportunity. Of course, don't everybody call at once, obviously, but we do have a phone number, and we would love to hear your ideas or suggestions or thoughts or concerns on some of the issues that we have been and will be dealing with here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676, of course, is HORN on your keypad. My email address, if you'd like to email me directly, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. As I have frequently mentioned on a Monday, it's usually 5 days between our Wednesday program, sign-off, and our Monday programs. This time it happens to be 7. And so, I always seem to get a little bit nervous on Mondays. I guess it's being away for that extended period of time. And as I prepare on Monday mornings, and as I was preparing for today's program this morning, I begin to get a little bit nervous because, very honestly, I spend time almost invariably every Monday thinking about just how serious this venture is and how appreciative I am of the opportunity to do it on a regular basis. And I so appreciate your willingness to tune in and listen to these programs. I really mean that. It is a tremendous, I take it as with a tremendous sense of responsibility to do the best job I can. So as I prepare, especially after being off the air for 4 or 5 days, I regularly begin to think about how serious this whole challenge is. How serious I take it, how appreciative I am of your willingness to remain with us through these programs, through thick and thin. And consequently, when I think about that, the pressure's on a little bit. And I've always kind of told myself that the pressure is a good thing. When you begin to take these opportunities too lightly or too casually, I think you run into trouble. I've heard interviews with people who are on stage, performers who are on stage, and they oftentimes will make the comment that they always are a little bit nervous before every performance. It doesn't matter how many times they've done it, and they believe that it's a healthy amount of pressure is a good thing, because it ensures that they will be at the top of their game. I've tried to tell myself that as well over the years. In teaching, for example, as the years went on, obviously the teaching, at least at the basic entry level, on some of the courses that I taught over and over and over again, year after year, there was a tendency to take these things a little bit lightly and figure, I know that stuff, I can handle that stuff, with one arm tied behind my back, so to speak. Fact of the matter is, I never allowed myself to do that. And I really believe that every single class that I ever taught, at least in my memory, every single class that I ever taught was a new preparation for me, even if I had been over the material over and over again. And especially since I've gotten into the source materials, into the primary documents more, and have begun to appreciate the depth of understanding and information and knowledge that there is contained in these primary documents, and to appreciate the extent to which these are open to interpretations, a variety of interpretations, I've really come to appreciate the fact that every time you go before a group like this, you carry with you a very, very serious responsibility and accountability to do the best job you can. I hope that every program, I hope, follows through on that pledge to myself. Again, our phone number, area code 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. I'm not going to go back again to where we were a week ago. You'll recall that in our last time together, we spent quite a bit of time looking at what I believe is a very positive redefinition, if you will, for the role of unions in the so-called new capitalism, in our current global economy. And we had talked about, in that previous program, we had talked about what I believe some of the major challenges or duties of these redefined or reinvested unions would be like. It seems to me that, just to kind of put that whole thing to rest in order to move on to another issue. The more I thought about after the program was over last Wednesday, and thought about the program and where I felt it was on target and where I felt perhaps it could have been a little bit stronger, one of the things I began to conclude is that it seems to me that what, in a sense, I was advocating, if I were to put it, the bottom line, so to speak, in the entire presentation I made about a redefined role for unions in the new capitalism, it seems to me that what we're talking about is finding a way to permit or enable unions to assume the role and the duties that heretofore in our society employers were able to define. You'll recall some weeks ago now, we talked about work, and we talked about the so-called fringe benefits of work, the character aspects of the educational experience that accompanies work. That, many of the values, many of the human values or the character traits that we seem to value most in our society have traditionally been part of working. We have learned these things on the job, so to speak. The development and the building and the strengthening of our character as individual human beings is, in many ways, somewhat defined by the nature of work itself. And in order to be successful and to do a good job at whatever it is we do, it seems to me there are a lot of requirements or a lot of character traits that we need to bring to the table. And the actual possession of a job and the responsibilities that go with it, it seems to me, cause these character traits, these values, to come into play and to be perfected, to be made stronger and better as time goes on. One of the things we saw in the New Capitalism, as it's explained to us by Richard Sennett, is that much of this was in the hands of the employer. It was the employer who was assigned, that society assigned the duties of retirement and unemployment and health care and all of those other things that were part of working. But that as employers have come to face the new, the competition, the global competition in the new capitalism, employers have jettisoned many of these associated responsibilities. And from their perspective, what they're most concerned about is the bottom line and the positive reaction of shareholders, stockholders, making sure that the value of the company and the stock in that company increases in order to benefit the shareholders of the company, of the corporation, as it were. Because of the focus, the obsession, you might say, with some of these bottom line issues, these so-called fringe benefits that were always associated with work have pretty much gone by the wayside. And I think we're seeing that. When employers tell us that they're having trouble finding skilled workers and that our workforce is deficient, it seems to me that obviously sometimes they're talking about the work skills themselves, but as often as not, they're talking about the character traits or the values that have always traditionally been associated with work. The dependability and the responsibility and the idea, the sense of self-reliance and trustworthiness and empathy and tolerance and all of these other things that we've always taken for granted as important in our society because theoretically, everybody works, and in working, these things seem to come with the job. We don't know how. We don't know how they develop or why they develop, but they do. It seems to me that with employers fulfilling this new role, this new competitive role in the new capitalism, they pretty well abandoned any sense of responsibility for these other things. And I feel, the reason that I felt that this was a topic worthy of several programs here at the Virtual Center, I felt that these values, these associated character traits, if you will, are keys to civic responsibility and citizenship in our society. I think that they are critical parts of what makes our society a society. Consequently, we all suffer if these values are lacking in too many of our citizens. And the fact of the matter is, while employers talk about the lack of skills in the workforce, I would suggest when you think about things like the drug problem and the numbers of people who don't seem to be able to pass a drug test in order to get a job in today's society, all of these things seem to reflect the absence of the kinds of value systems, the core values that have always defined our society and the opportunities and the value of living in this kind of a society and the opportunities that it provided. I believe we're missing something. And I believe if we don't find a way to bring those values back into the picture, we will continue to experience problems. I see unions as being a vehicle, a major vehicle for causing those things to happen. In other words, I see a new role for unions in picking up the slack, picking up the responsibilities that traditionally in the society employers exercise, but that they are not exercising anymore. Consequently, I see the issues as very important, and I see the unions as the potential vehicle for raising and addressing these issues as being important as well. That's really why I believe that the time we spent on this particular issue was time well spent. Obviously, it's been a week since we touched on these things, and I know the issues are probably very rusty for those of you out there who were able to participate in some of these programs. But if you have thoughts, we sure would love to hear from you. This would be a good time to air them. Again, our number, 304-663-4676. Before we get into something a little bit meaty, if you will, in today's program, I'd like to share with you a piece that was in this morning's Washington Post. It was a column by Robert Samuelson, the economist, and he regularly writes a column in the Washington Post. He's very, very good, I think. A lot of good information in some of these. And again, it doesn't mean, and many people believe that Samuelson is a little bit more conservative in his economic thinking than they would like, and many people feel much more comfortable with Krugman, with Paul Krugman, for example, in the New York Times, who's one of our more notable economists in the country, Columbia University, but is considered to be a little bit more liberal, much more liberal than Samuelson. But I think one can get into mistakes if we begin to characterize people as being too conservative, too liberal, or whatever. I think what we need to do is deal with the substance of what they have to contribute. And I think we can all learn from that if we approach it in the right frame of mind. I know we've had programs in the past, for example, where I've cited Thomas Friedman, and there are a lot of people out there that don't like Thomas Friedman and won't read Thomas Friedman. They see him as a hypocrite and a number of other things. I understand the basis for some people feeling this way. But at the same time, I don't think there's any denying the fact that Friedman is one of the most insightful, knowledgeable people about international affairs in the world today. It's not an accident that he's called as a consultant to the White House and to various other places when major policy decisions are on the table, because he's knowledgeable. I don't know anybody offhand that knows quite as much about the Middle East as does Friedman, and we know that there's so much going on in the Middle East today, and it's so complicated and so complex, it's extremely difficult to get our arms around it, and so therefore, you know, the value of a Friedman to kind of put into context exactly what seems to be happening over there and why it affects us this way and that way and the possibility of another way, it seems to me, is all very, very important information. I feel the same way about David Brooks in the New York Times. David Brooks, no question, is more conservative than some of the other columnists in the New York Times. But his information, the fact that he reads, it's very, very infrequent when a month goes by where Brooks is not sharing with us a substantive article or a new book or a couple of new books or whatever that he's reviewing. In other words, he reads and thinks all the time. And I don't, you know, whatever his political philosophy is, it seems to me ought not to diminish the value of the substance of what this man has to offer. I feel the same way about Samuelson in the Washington Post. Samuelson provides some very, very good information about the economy, not just our nation's economy, but the global economy itself. And in today's piece in the Washington Post, Samuelson is talking about the plight of the young and the unemployed. In fact, that's the title of his piece. The plight of the young and the unemployed. Not just in the United States, but in the developed world generally. And he introduces us to a new acronym. And that acronym is NEET. He calls these people NEETs, N-E-E-T. And by NEET, he's referring to those people, those young people, who are neither employed nor in education or training. Not employed or in education or training, NEET. And Samuelson points out that there are roughly 39 million of these folks, these NEETs, in 33 of the world's most advanced industrial countries. And he cites for evidence a new report put out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And their report is that in 33 of the world's more advanced industrial countries, there are roughly 39 million NEETs, young people who are neither employed nor in education nor in any kind of training. Samuelson connects these in our country. Samuelson relates to these to what we call the millennials, young adults who were born after 1980. So in other words, they would be, 1980 would be 35 years ago. So basically what we're talking about by millennials, we're talking about those who are 35 years or younger. And Samuelson says that, it refers to them and says, I'm reading directly from his piece, they are the victims of poor timing and indifferent public policies. Coming of age in a harsh economy, they find it hard to get work, especially work for which they're qualified. By the millions, they're living with parents and postponing marriage, children, and buying homes. Many are burdened with heavy student loans. Those with jobs subsidize their usually better off elders through Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes. And that's a quote from Samuelson's piece this morning. I wanted to focus on a couple of aspects of that. More specifically, the comment that those millennials with jobs are subsidizing their usually better off elders through Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes. And it seems to me, and again, he doesn't specifically say this, but the inference that Samuelson seems to be making here is that somehow one generation is subsidizing the previous one. The implication, of course, is that the group being subsidized, the elders in Medicare and Social Security, seemingly didn't earn their rights to Social Security and Medicare. Initially, when the Social Security program began, that was true. But as the years have gone on, we have established a tradition where each generation is paying for the generation ahead of it, if you will. In a sense, it's linking the generations together in a way which builds a sense of community. I don't think that's suggested here in Samuelson's comments at all. The way Samuelson presents this, it almost seems as if he's being critical of the extent to which the elder generation is exploiting, using government programs to exploit working young people. I would suggest that particular point of view is not a socially healthy one, because it leads directly to the idea that those paying into Social Security could receive much better returns on their investment if they put their money into the stock market. If they invested more wisely, the return would be better. The implication is that Social Security ought to be, or is supposed to be, a paying investment opportunity. Going all the way back to the creation of the Social Security program in the mid-1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt never really thought about it this way. To him, it was a program in which working people paid into. And the result was that as the years went on, people would have paid in a substantial amounts of money into Social Security before they begin to draw it and before they begin to draw Medicare. No question that those who are currently working do indeed subsidize the program in their Social Security taxes and their Medicare taxes. No question. But we can't ever overlook the social aspects of this program and the extent to which this intergenerational dependency is significant in our society, because very honestly, we're losing it. And very honestly, those people who are loudest in their criticisms and their attack on Social Security and the others, and Medicare and Obamacare too, I guess, they're emphasizing the investment opportunities or lack thereof of working people putting their money into these programs when they could realize a much bigger return putting it elsewhere. It's important to recognize that their return on their money never was the significant part of it. Those that are reaping the benefit of their investments in Social Security and Medicare are the people who are currently drawing on Social Security and Medicare as part of their retirement. And theoretically, this would go on generation after generation. That was the plan. And I think there's a tendency, especially on the part of economists, to overlook or to ignore this important social aspect of the intergenerational dependency that the Social Security program and Medicare speak to. And I think that's very significant. I'm not saying that Robert Samuelson is wrong here, because he doesn't specifically deny that there's a social responsibility, but the tone of what he says suggests that he's not really recognizing it or not giving it the credibility that it deserves. But again, what Samuelson gives us is some really important information. The fact that in the major developed societies, nations, in today's industrialized world, the top 33 nations, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 million young adults who not only can't find jobs, but the implication is probably are not even looking for them anymore. And this poses a very serious threat to these particular societies. There is absolutely no question. Samuelson becomes a little bit more specific in the information. And remember, this information comes from the new report of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's their data. And Samuelson provides even more substantive data. In Great Britain, France, and the United States, he says, NEETs comprise 16% of the 15 to 29-year-old population as of 2013. So in our country, in the United States, as well as France and Britain, young people who are neither employed nor in any form of education or training comprise 16% of the population. In South Korea and Ireland, that share is 19%. In Italy, Spain, and Greece, it's approximately 25%. And of course, the other factor to keep in mind is that in many of these countries, those that are working have jobs that are only temporary. They are not stable, good-paying jobs in many cases. And then Samuelson points out two serious questions that this data raises. And this is the reason, these questions are the reasons that I wanted to share this with you, because I think all of us are facing this. I know here in West Virginia, for example, we've seen it in our economy for some time because of the battle, the whole issue of coal and the so-called war against coal. The number of coal jobs in West Virginia has declined precipitously over the last 35 years. And right now, there's obviously an inclination, and not unintentional, on the part of many of the companies and the political leaders here in West Virginia to blame the Obama administration and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for imposing limitations on fossil fuel that are costing jobs. But the fact of the matter is, we know that over the course of the last 30 to 35 years, the number of coal jobs in West Virginia has gone from 125,000 in 1980 to a little bit better than 16,000 today. So in a sense, what we've seen is that more than approximately 110,000 coal jobs in West Virginia have disappeared in the last 30 to 35 years. Obviously, we can't blame the Obama administration for all of that. Technology automation is a significant part of it. Concerns about climate, concerns about air and water, clean air and clean water are part of it. And the fact of the matter is, if you read what's going on in other nations around the world, coal is taking a beating everywhere. I read this very quickly over the weekend. I believe it was Norway. One of the northern European nations, I believe Norway, has pulled all of its investment money out of fossil fuel investments. And this is just symbolic of what's happening in other places. And it seems to me, unfortunately, that West Virginia is going to be the last to begin to address the need for diversification, for economic diversification and change. And there's some question as to whether, in fact, the climate damage has not already been done. I guess what I'm saying is, there are some people that are beginning to say that it might already be too late to do anything about it. But anyway, the two questions that Samuelson raises about this data, about the number of NEETs in industrialized countries today, the first one is to whether this extended joblessness will affect the employability, the permanent employability, and the earnings of these people. In other words, the fact that they're out of work now is one thing. But as they remain unemployed for a significant period of time, what does that mean in terms of their ability to secure a job in the future? Are they, in effect, becoming unemployable by the fact that they aren't working right now? And Samuelson makes the point, which I think we made here at the Virtual Center. A job is not just a paycheck, he says. It is also an education. And so that's what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about these values, these character traits, if you will. That's the product of education. And if people aren't working, then those benefits, if you will, of work are not being realized. And so consequently, our level of unemployment today in the industrialized world might be even more critical, because it could be rendering these people incapable of ever working meaningfully again. So it seems to me that addressing this problem as quickly as possible is critical for the governments of these nations, including ours. Because, again, Samuelson makes the point that while some skills of work are rather simple, showing up on time, learning how to take instruction, dealing with customers or co-workers, those kinds of things are pretty basic. But he also points out that there are other skills that involve specialized competencies. These are taught, and they are perfected only by working. You don't pick them up in school, you pick them up on the job. It seems to me we need to recognize that, and we need to make sure that the jobs provide those. That's been the basis of our programs for the last couple of weeks. So that's the first question that these statistics on these so-called NEETs raises, is are we in effect facing not just a level of unemployment that exists now, but a level of unemployment that's likely not to get very much sooner, because of the competencies and the skills that are not being employed because they aren't working. Then, and this, it seems to me, is even more dramatic and dire issue, the second question, Samuelson says, does prolonged unemployment erode self-confidence, undermine the ability to form durable relationships, and does it radicalize people in terms of their politics? In other words, are we living in a society where working, the possession of a job, of a steady income, is what keeps the society functioning? And if we find ourselves confronting too many of these young people in their 20s who have already given up looking for meaningful work, we may be seeing the radicalization of the younger population of this generation. Basically, what that means is that they are not part of mainstream society. Rather, because they don't have jobs, they tend to be living on the fringe. Consequently, and this the report that Samuelson cites makes this point. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development makes this point about its data, and says these NEETs could become a burden for their countries, from lower tax revenues, higher welfare payments, and the social instability that may arise when part of the population is out of work and demoralized. So the question is, what do we need to do, and how quickly can we do it to address these problems? There's absolutely no question that as an economist, as a practicing economist, Robert Samuelson puts his faith in the system itself. In other words, he believes, he is trained to believe that the global economy will provide the opportunities and the solutions to these problems. I guess the question is, how realistic is that faith? To me, that's why I see this new role for unions as being so critical. I think somebody needs to do it. As we've looked at the new capitalism, we've begun to recognize that employers can't do it. And because of our concerns about socialism and communism and all these other isms, we don't want government to do it. So it seems to me if governments shouldn't do it, and employers can't do it, then we need to look to employees themselves and or their representatives to do it. And that seems to me, again, to bring us back to a new role for unions in our society. The reason I wanted to share this Samuelson piece with you is because it seemed to fit so perfectly into the last couple of weeks of programming here that we've done at the Virtual Center. It seems to reinforce, it brings data to the table, which seems to reinforce the degree of the challenge. I think it's a real one. I don't think that Richard Sennett's book, written in 2006, I don't believe that he misspoke at all. I think what he was doing was predicting a future which in many cases has come to pass over the last 10 years since he wrote that book. And I think Robert Samuelson's article today and the research organization that put the data together are reinforcing the extent to which this remains a serious problem. I don't think it's an accident that right now President Obama is overseas with the 7 major governments of the 7 major industrial powers, the so-called G7, trying to find some solutions to this. Part of the problem, part of the challenge, it seems to me, is ISIS. There's no question that concerns about ISIS and concerns about Putin and Russia are liable to dominate that conference to the point that issues like this never get brought up, and I think that would be quite unfortunate. Anyway, that's kind of where we are, and that's what I think. And I welcome your thoughts and your ideas if you have them on this issue, because I think it is a very, very serious issue. I'm a little bit reluctant to address this next issue, but it's so appropriate for the Virtual Center that I couldn't not raise it. We'll probably have to extend it into our second hour today. There's no way. We've got about 15 minutes or so, 16 minutes left in this first hour. I don't think we can cover the lot on this in 15 minutes. We can at least begin. In today's Washington Post, there is a feature article on Great Britain. And I think the title of the article will give you some idea, not only of where I think we need to go, but more importantly, why it seems to be an issue here at the Virtual Center. This Washington Post article is entitled, "After 800 years, Britain finally asks, do we need a written constitution?" And the article addresses serious efforts within Great Britain to convene a convention in order to draft a written constitution. Britain is one of 3 major democracies, popular governments, republics, if you will, that doesn't have a written constitution. 3. I feel like Rick Perry during the debates last year because I can think of 2. Obviously, Great Britain is one and Israel is one. And I am rapidly going through this article to New Zealand is the 3rd one. So in today's world, there are 3 republics that still do not have written constitutions: New Zealand, Israel, and Great Britain. The reason this article is so timely is because the 800-year anniversary of Magna Carta will be celebrated on the 15th of this month, June 15th. Many of you will remember, if you remember your history and you had to memorize dates as I did, the Magna Carta in the year 1215, June 15th, 1215. So on June 15th, we will be celebrating the 800th anniversary of the drafting of the Magna Carta. Now, after 800 years, Great Britain is seriously playing with and considering the issue of a written constitution. That's the thrust of this article. I think it's a significant question, and I think it raises significant issues that we would be remiss here at the Virtual Center if we didn't address. Let me see if I can put this into context a little bit and establish why I think this is a significant issue. Here in this country, we are witnessing efforts to call a second constitutional convention in order to amend our written constitution. And we spent a number of programs looking at the founders and looking at some of the potential problems associated in today's political climate of putting the Constitution of the United States on the table for revision at this point. Madison warned us against the Second Convention. Hamilton warned us against the Second Convention. There is absolutely no question that Madison's support for a Bill of Rights was driven principally by a concern that opponents of the Constitution were actively lobbying for a second convention to consider amendments. Madison felt that that was the most dangerous thing that could ever happen in this country. The entire Constitution, he believed, would be lost if we put the subject back on the table. So Madison was determined at all costs to find ways to avoid the convening of a second constitutional convention. His support for the Bill of Rights, in large part, was in many ways was his strategy. If we put amendments on the Constitution, if we send out prospective Bill of Rights, Madison believed, we would cut off the movement for a second convention at its knees. In the minds of many people, there would be no need for a second convention once we had a Bill of Rights. That was Madison's thinking. That was his strategy. And I think his concerns and his fear about a second convention drove him in many ways to seek any way reasonable to avoid the convening of a second constitutional convention. Now in Great Britain, a nation that for 800 years has never had a written constitution. Notice, I didn't say a constitution, I said a written constitution. Is now considering adopting one. It seems to me that the circumstances or the context within which these things are happening are very telling. A few weeks ago, Great Britain experienced an election. And I'm sure many of you recall reading the results of that election. The polls, prior to Election Day, the polls were suggesting it was going to be a toss-up. The polls suggested that Prime Minister Cameron and the Conservative majority in Great Britain could likely be ousted as a result of this election. Lo and behold, the exact opposite happened. It was a conservative sweep. It was an overwhelming conservative victory, to the point that it made coalition building within government unnecessary. The conservatives now have a working majority in Parliament. The Cameron government calls the shots. There are some people who believe that the power of the Prime Minister in Great Britain equates, or at least mirrors, dictatorial power. Because what the majority of Parliament wants, it gets. There's no separation of powers. There's no court to rule on the constitutionality of a particular piece of legislation. There's no executive branch of government. We know that we have the Queen, but that position is more figurehead than it is power. Influence, yes. Reverence for the Queen and for the Crown, yes. I mean, I think you can tell that by the emphasis on the babies being born to Prince Harold and Katie. But the fact of the matter is, Great Britain in this last election saw the shift to the right in political power in Parliament so dramatic that the balance, the moderation, if you will, that traditionally has existed in British politics conceivably might be at an end. There's little to stop the Conservatives from pushing their agenda. Oftentimes, the need to find a working majority and to build coalitions in order to govern has tempered and moderated political reality in Great Britain. As a result of the elections, recent elections, that moderation is effectively gone. I would suggest to you that the situation in this country by those pushing for a second convention, a movement that is funded, well funded by conservative groups like the Koch Foundation, suggest powerful forces in this country taking it in the same direction. Progressives here in the United States and in Great Britain are on their heels. There's no question. The effort to reduce the power of the federal government in this country by amendment to the Constitution and return power to the states reflects the same kind of mentality, political mentality, that is driving Scotland to separate from the United Kingdom. It's the same kind of mentality that is causing conservatives in Great Britain to question whether in fact Britain is part of Europe or not. There's serious question as to whether Great Britain will withdraw from the European Union. There's serious question whether there's going to be any way to stop Scotland from seceding and establishing its own government and its own nation. It's the same kind of mentality, if you will, that is driving the Second Convention here in the United States. And it stands to reason then that those people in Great Britain who are most adamant about the need for a written constitution seek to draft a constitution in order to check the current trend in British politics, the conservative rightward movement of British politics. So we have kind of an either or. They appear to be opposites, but they're really quite similar. In the United States, those who would try to stop, halt, slow down the move to the right in this country feel the only way to do it is to make sure that a second convention never meets. In Great Britain, there is no written constitution. So those that would stop the conservative trend there believe that they might be able to do it by drafting a written constitution. In other words, in this country, those pushing for a second convention have an agenda. In Great Britain, those moving for a written constitution have an agenda as well. And I think it's important to recognize those realities, those facts. What is going on in Great Britain right now as a debate goes on about a convention, a written constitution, seems to me to have very, very real relevance for us here in the United States, because it's speaking to many of the same political concerns and considerations we have here. And the more I thought about this, the more I recognized how absolutely critical this issue is to air here at the Virtual Center. It's what we're about. If you go back to the 1780s and the movement, the conservative movement in the 1780s to draft the Constitution, the efforts of the Hamiltons and the Madisons and the Robert Morrises and the Charles Carroll of Carrolltons and the others, to build the movement which ultimately leads to the Constitutional Convention. The goal is change. The purpose of our Constitution in 1787 was to change what was happening in the nation under the Articles of Confederation. It was to produce political change in order to halt the direction that the nation was heading in. In fact, there really wasn't a nation. There were 13 independent states, if you recall. And there was all sorts of problems emerging as a result of the rivalry and the competition, not only between the American states, independent states, and European nations, but also amongst the states themselves. Rivalries over trade and territories and taxes and land and all of these other things. Those that saw the future of this country in jeopardy believed that the only way to preserve a future, a stable future, was to redirect the trend by creating a strong central government under the Constitution of the United States. Now in Great Britain, those who are looking at the political directions and the political trends going on there, after 800 years, are now beginning to recognize that a written constitution in Great Britain is called for. So again, I think the circumstances, the political context within which these two things are happening are so similar, and each helps us understand the other so well that I think we would be remiss not to recognize what exactly is happening. This article on Great Britain and the move to adopt or draft a written constitution is written up as a feature story in this morning's Washington Post. There's no question that what prompts it is the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta in 1215. We are in, as you know, 2015. I'd like to share when we come back, we've reached the top of the hour here at the Virtual Center. I'd like to take our 5-minute break, and then when we come back, I'd like to look at some of the arguments and some of the issues associated with this in Great Britain. But I really believe that the context within which this is happening help us understand and appreciate exactly what's going on there, because it so mirrors what went on here in the 1780s. We got our written constitution and our strong central government because we didn't like the direction that things were going in. Madison and Hamilton and the others didn't like the direction the nation was going in the 1780s. Now, forces in Great Britain are trying to draft a written constitution because they don't like the direction that the way things seem to be going in Great Britain in the year 2015. And they feel that by adopting a written constitution, they might be able to gain a sense of stability and balance and to halt this movement to the right. I think it's astounding. I think the similarity is astounding. We're at 2 minutes after the hour, 2 minutes after 2 in the East. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back and we'll complete our second hour here at the Virtual Center. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the second hour here at the Virtual Center. We are at 7 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East, 7 minutes after the hour. And if you are just joining us, welcome to today's program here at the Virtual Center. If you've been with us through our first hour, then I want to thank you for staying with us. I hope that speaks to the relevance of the information and the fact that I believe that some of the material we're looking at today really has some information worth having for all of us. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. If you are just joining us, let me kind of bring you up to where we are. We started a topic just prior to the break at the top of the hour. Excuse me. On the celebration on the 15th of this month of the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. And today's Washington Post has a feature story addressing this issue, but most specifically, the issue of the movement within Great Britain to draft a written constitution. One of the things that the article points out is that Great Britain is one of only 3 popular governments, major republics in the world, the others being Israel and New Zealand, who do not have written constitutions. It doesn't mean that they don't have a constitution. Many of us will recognize that what was so significant in the 1780s about the U.S. Constitution and the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but even more with the writing of state constitutions with the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was the idea that only a written constitution would be sufficient. The colonies, if you recall, were reeling under what they believed was oppression on the part of the mother country over colonial freedoms and colonial rights. And much of the debate, much of the discussion within the colonies focused on the fact that the British Constitution was not written. That really the British Constitution was the sum total of decisions, common law decisions, parliamentary laws, treaty obligations, and throughout history a series of historical conventions. That over time the Constitution just evolved as a result of these laws being passed by Parliament, of the decisions being reached in the courts under common law, and all the rest of it. The only people that really knew what the British Constitution was all about were attorneys. Because there was nothing written. There was nothing for the people to hang on to in terms of written law or written rules or rights or anything like that. But over time, people became wedded to the British Constitution even though it wasn't written down. And there's no question that Britain and its Constitution is what gave rise to written constitutions around the world. First one, of course, being with the American Revolution, and then the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And a couple of years later, the efforts of the French Revolution to write a new constitution for France. And we kind of know where that went. But the fact of the matter is, there is a British Constitution, but it's not written. And therefore, most people, according to this article, most people in Great Britain don't even know that there's a constitution. And this movement to write one and to get one adopted is an effort to, what they believe, right that wrong. Graham Allen, who's a member of Parliament and ended up chairing the Constitutional Reform Committee appointed by Parliament to spend 4 years drafting a model constitution. Graham Allen says, and I'm quoting directly from the article, people should know the rules of their governance, he says. But I don't think most Britons even know we have a constitution. Allen's committee commissioned a 4-year effort by scholars at King's College, London, to draft a model constitution that could be used as a blueprint if the nation ever came around to writing a constitution. The result of that study at King's College was published last year. The product, 71 pages long, lays out, according to this article, lays out everything from the formal name of the country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to a Bill of Rights. Allen then made it in order to build support for the idea of a written constitution, Allen came up with the idea of a national contest for people to suggest the preamble to this Constitution. In fact, he promised a bottle of House of Commons champagne to whoever could come up with the most eloquent preamble to this model Constitution. The winning entry begins as follows. United we stand in celebration of the diverse voices that make up the great chorus of our nation. Pretty cool. I think it reads beautifully. United, we stand in celebration of the diverse voices that make up the great chorus of our nation. Of course, ours, as you know, the a pluribus unum thing. The fact of the matter is, and I think this is relevant information, and it comes directly from this article, the United Kingdom is really not one nation. Actually, it's four. Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And of course, for most of its history, power has been monopolized in London. London has been the driver of this. In the House of Lords, a member of the House of Lords, I'm trying to get his complete name, Jeremy Purvis, P-U-R-V-I-S, Jeremy Purvis. He's the one pushing the House of the Constitutional Convention in the House of Lords. And he said that the United Kingdom needs to refresh and redefine itself if it's going to survive in the face of some of the things that have happened now with the election, and the nationalism in Scotland and the threat to disengage, and the debate in England as to whether to not be any longer a member of the European Union. Purvis says, in the vacuum of there not being a statement about what holds the Union together, it allows nationalism in England and Scotland to flourish. I want there to be something that holds together as Britishness. How close is that to the thinking of Madison and the others in the 1780s about drafting a national constitution in order to create a national government, in order to stop the particularism of 13 states going in their own selfish, independent directions? This is what Purvis sees happening in the United Kingdom now. Nationalism in England and Scotland is flourishing, and it's liable to tear the kingdom, the United Kingdom, apart. And the purpose of the Constitution is to hold it together. There's no way, at least according to this article, and I think from my reading I would agree, I don't think there's any way that the Cameron conservative government is going to endorse the drafting of a written constitution. I think in spite of all the arguments in favor of it, the fact of the matter is it's probably not going to be successful. This article points out it might get through the House of Commons. It might get through the House of Lords, but it'll never make it through the House of Commons, because the House of Commons now has a working conservative majority. Now that they have power, why would they jeopardize it by drafting rules and regulations that they would have to live by? They don't seem to have anything to gain. Rather, they seem to have everything to lose by endorsing the idea of a written constitution at this point. This is significant. Graham Allen's Constitutional Reform Committee was disbanded last week after the most recent elections. So Parliament pulled the rug out from under this reform committee. Allen, member of Parliament, who chaired that committee, Allen makes this comment: government is an 800-pound gorilla. Parliament is a mouse. If the mouse squeaks, the gorilla stomps on the mouse. I was stomped on, unquote. I think what Allen is telling us is that the move to draft a written constitution in Great Britain, while it seemed to be picking up steam, has effectively been killed by the new conservative majority in Parliament. The committee that was appointed to enact or to draft constitutional reform was just disbanded a week ago. Defenders of Britain's traditional ways, this is really interesting. Defenders of Britain's traditional ways say there's good reason not to change what has worked for this country for ages. Philip Norton, member of the House of Lords and a constitutional scholar, said that codifying the Constitution would amount to fitting the country with a straitjacket when it needs to be flexible enough to evolve with changing times. I think what we have here is a clear indication as to who's moving for a written constitution and who's opposed to it. What those who are opposed to it, the ones that are currently in power, are able to draw on for support is the 800-year tradition that speaks to the fact that in 800 years Britain has not needed a written constitution. Why all of a sudden does it need one now? Their argument. So they've got tradition, they've got history on their side. So consequently, those who would advocate change, namely a written constitution, carry the burden of proof. They would have to make the case successfully enough to convince a majority of Parliament, controlled by the Conservatives, to adopt a position that they don't currently support. Norton says it's undesirable, unnecessary, and unachievable. Trying to craft a written constitution now might only deepen the country's problems. And then a political scientist at the University of Essex named Anthony King points out that constitutions usually rise out of a major upheaval, such as war or revolution. That spark has never been lit for Britain, therefore we've never needed a written constitution. I guess the question that we would confront in order to resolve this now is whether in fact the last election, the election just a couple of weeks ago, that produced this overwhelming conservative majority in Parliament, whether in fact this constitutes a revolution. Is this a significant enough shift in ideological direction that the United Kingdom could end up experiencing changes that it never anticipated and likely never wants? The separation of Scotland, Britain's separation from Europe, is the Cameron government potentially dealing with a totally changed status for Britain in the world of the future, in the rest of the 21st century? Traditionally, Britain has been a major power. It dominated the world at the time the colonies were established. Obviously, it sacrificed much of that power with the rise of the United States in the late 19th and especially the early 20th century. But the fact of the matter is Great Britain has still been a major player on the world stage. It was responsible for colonizing India, and even though India is now independent as of 1948, I think, of 1946 perhaps, The fact of the matter is there's so much institutionally in contemporary India that smacks of its colonial status with England. The same is true for South Africa and many of the other areas of the world that Britain controlled for so long. If the United Kingdom is about to disintegrate with the separation of Scotland and England's removal from the politics of Europe, it is entirely possible that British power and influence in the world could suffer a major setback. Obviously, this has significant meaning for the British. I would suggest it also has significant meaning for the United States as well. And I do believe that that is particularly significant. Ultimately, we've been able to count on British support more than the support of other nations. In the future, there's a question as to whether that support from a weakened United Kingdom is going to mean as much. But again, and I'm kind of bringing this issue to an end, but to a conclusion, I think the important thing here is not the actual substance of a written constitution, so much as what the move for a constitution is designed to do. In classes I've taught over the years, I found some years ago that it was essential at the very beginning of a class, a history class, to challenge some common assumptions which were wrong. One of those assumptions, the one that I spend the most time on, is the idea that the law is objective, that it's not political. The fact of the matter is, if you read history carefully, you begin to recognize that every single law ever written was drafted by somebody to accomplish something for somebody, usually at the expense of somebody else. The law, by definition, is designed to control the behavior of somebody. It's never neutral. It's never objective. We, as students, through our K through 12 system in this country, we were taught that we are a nation governed by the rule of law. That law is the same for everybody. That nobody, no person or people are above the law. That everybody must obey the law. And the implication is this is one aspect of the idea of true equality in our society, equality before the law. When it comes down to we as individuals standing before the law, we're all equal. Nobody's any better or more important than anybody else. And that's the message that we got in our civic education classes. The implication being that law is objective. Its intent is to put down in writing what's right. The implication of a law, if people are going to support it, people need to believe in it. They need to believe that it's fair, that it's necessary, that it works to the benefit of everybody, not just a few. And from the very beginning, as part of our education as citizens, our socialization into our mainstream, if you will, has been to convince us that the law is objective and neutral and it treats everybody the same. That it's fair. I'm not saying that it's not. What I am saying is there's never been a case when law wasn't written for a reason. The reason laws pass is because the majority of people who vote for them see a positive good coming out of that law, and on the other hand, see the danger of something bad not happening as a result of the law. To put it another way, I've found myself saying this frequently. Man-made law by definition, statute law by definition, usually reflects the efforts of some people to control the behavior of others. What that means is it's not objective. It's not neutral. It has a political purpose. Law reflects somebody's agenda in its efforts to forbid or to allow certain things, to promote or to forbid certain behaviors. It's going to benefit somebody. It's going to inhibit or hurt somebody. And consequently, even though we have been educated to believe that the Supreme Court merely interprets the law, our judges are not political, they aren't Republicans or Democrats, they're legal scholars. And their job is to look at the law, look at the Constitution, and make the determination as to what right is in a particular situation. This is right because. So consequently, the justices will always justify by putting in the historical background. In other words, putting in the rationale as to why the court rules the way it rules. And of course, the reason that there's so much support throughout history in this country for the courts is that we have always believed that the courts are neutral, that they are objective, that they are not political. The big debate that has traditionally gone on in our society, in our nation's history, constitutional history, has been the traditional debate between judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial activism is the idea that if you can't get something necessary through the legislative branch of government, and you still believe that it's necessary, but it's not politically possible to get it enacted into statute law, then the courts can make it happen through judicial interpretation. In other words, by the way they interpret the law, interpret the Constitution, courts can make law that legislatures can't or won't pass. And traditionally, it's been conservatives who are most opposed to that. It's been conservatives who traditionally have been defenders of the idea of judicial restraint. The idea that the role of the court is to say what the law is. It's not to make law. It's to weigh statute law against the Constitution and make the determination as to what's right and what's wrong, what's constitutional and what's not. The implication of that frame of reference, of that approach, has been the idea then that Supreme Court decisions are not political decisions at all. It's almost like a machine. It's almost like a computer. You feed in the data, and out comes the right answer. Many people believe that's the way the courts should operate, were intended to operate, and for the most part do operate. So we've traditionally had this debate in our constitutional history between advocates of judicial restraint and advocates of judicial activism. And traditionally, the conservatives have been the ones in favor of restraint. And it's usually been liberals who are advocates of judicial activism because they see the courts as the only vehicle for getting the right kind of changes made against the forces of tradition and the forces of business as usual. The advocates of change always bear the burden of proof. And those resistant to change can claim the advantage of tradition. That's what's happening in Britain right now with the debate over the last couple of years of a written constitution. Those who don't want it because they're now in power. But they can't say that. It would be politically foolish to publicly say the reason we don't want a written constitution is because we're in the driver's seat now. Why would we voluntarily restrain ourselves? And as the quote that I read a few minutes ago said, why should we put a straitjacket on ourselves now that we're in power? The only people that want change are the people that fear power as it's currently being exercised. The conservatives are in the driver's seat. They don't want change. They don't want a written constitution. They suffered through this unwritten constitution for generations. Now they're in power. The last thing they want is change. In the United States, on the other hand, in our country, since the New Deal and the liberalism of the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, it's been liberals, progressives, who have largely been in the driver's seat. And it's been conservatives who have been trying to find ways to slow the progressive train down, to slow progressivism, slow reform, slow change. Consequently, it stands to reason that they would be the ones who would be advocates of judicial restraint. They would like to deny the court the ability to make law by the decisions that it reaches in determining constitutionality of a particular man-made law, a piece of statute law. So again, what is my point? My point is that law is never objective. It's never neutral. And the key to really appreciating and learning from the past, it seems to me, is recognizing the winners and the losers by asking the very difficult questions that a good education will demand of students. If you read a particular law, you can memorize it, or you can read it and say to yourself, who wins by passing this law? Who would stand the most to gain by drafting this particular law? Who would most be hurt by the passage of this particular law? And you can determine that by reading the context, reading the law itself, reading the language, the text. Who's it aimed at? Whose behavior does it seek to control? If the law is successful and is able to control that behavior, who wins? Would further research support the idea that the people who most win are the people who initially brought up the law in the first place and drafted it? During the period in American history, which is probably the so-called progressive period, the period when government was probably as big and as active and as regulatory and as intrusive as it's ever been before or since, the period of Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century, when government was enacting all sorts of regulations. What historians have found is that whereas textbooks used to look at the laws being passed, the regulations being passed during the progressive era, and assume that these regulatory efforts to control the behavior of business, of corporations, were by definition anti-corporate. What research has shown us is that more often than not, these laws were written by the very people whose behavior would be regulated. In other words, what government was doing was allowing the companies to be regulated to write the rules and say, look, the public is demanding some sort of regulation on your behavior. You submit, you write the law, the kind of law that we can go to the public and say, see, we're regulating them. You write the law that seems to regulate you but does the least damage to your business operations. You write a law so that it becomes something that you can live with. That is an interpretation that never made it into the textbooks for a long time. It's there now. But when that first came out in the mid-20th century, critics were calling it communist and socialist and Marxist and everything else for alleging that that was true. Because the traditional interpretation was business was guilty of certain abuses, and in an open representative government, government came to the rescue on behalf of its citizens to regulate the behavior of these businesses. That's the traditional approach. That's what children were taught. Children were never taught or told that more often than not, those that were being regulated were the ones writing the rules, and that government allowed them to do that. What is that evidence of? It's evidence that laws and rules are never neutral. They are never objective. They are written by somebody for a purpose. They are written to control the behavior of somebody for a purpose. Constitutions are the same way. This is the virtual center for the study of the Constitution. And I would suggest to you the one message that I hope in 2 years and 4 months or so that we've been doing these programs, I'm hoping that the one message that has come through loud and clear, at least I've tried to send it, is that in order to understand what's in the Constitution, you need to have some idea of the situation of the circumstances which led to that Constitution. If there's certain things in the Constitution, it's important to know why they're there, who put them there, what was the agenda, what did they want, what did they not want, what did they want to prevent. And when those are the kinds of questions that really provide the keys to understanding the documents. And one of the things you realize very quickly when you do that is that these things are never neutral. they never are without a political flavor or some sense of political meaning. This month, we are in June. Today is the 8th day of June. At the end of this month, the end of June, the Supreme Court's session will end. There's no question that one of the major decisions that the court will be making over the next 2.5 or 3 weeks is going to be based on the extent to which companies, corporations are persons and thereby have a right to religious protection under the First Amendment. This, of course, is the famous Hobby Lobby case. You'll recall several months ago that the case was heard before the Supreme Court. And the only obligation the court has is to reach a decision on that case before the end of its term. And the end of that term is in 3 weeks. So in the next 3 weeks, the Supreme Court is going to be making one of the most monumental, significant decisions in years. Many people believe that the most significant decision the court reached recently is the 2010 Citizens United decision. This one promises to be equally important. And the predictions are already being made. The 4 conservatives will vote one way, the 4 liberals will vote the other way, and therefore it comes down to Justice Kennedy as being the swing vote. And so the pundits are looking at the past judicial activity of Justice Kennedy in order to try to get some inkling as to which way he's probably going to go. We know that the tendency of John Roberts and Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas and I'm stuck for the 4th conservative on the court, and I'm sorry, drawing a blank. But we know that these people vote traditionally together as one, as does the other branch, or the other group. It's obviously important to recognize that they have ideological preferences, priorities. They are not legal machines. They are not ATM machines that spit out judicial interpretations based on hard data. They are living, breathing human beings who have preferences, who have druthers. Whether they're political, whether they're philosophical, whether they're economic, whether they're social, or whatever. And their decisions reflect those priorities. These are not neutral, objective, non-human, dead people. They are living, breathing human beings with priorities and prejudices. Consequently, how they rule on this particular case is going to be incredibly significant for the future. Because we've already seen with the rush of states to pass religious freedom legislation that potentially discriminated against same-sex marriage and against gays, there was such an outcry that states like Indiana and Louisiana were forced to back off. But there's no question that if the Supreme Court rules the right way at the end of this month, they'll be back with those religious freedom legislations in state after state. So the potential of this decision is huge. My point is that it is not politically objective. It is not neutral. Rather, they are political decisions made by people to accomplish certain things by affecting the behavior of others. That's what the law is. That's what constitutions are about. That's what the debate over a written constitution in Great Britain is about. Jeremy Purvis in the House of Lords and Graham Allen in Parliament, who were the advocates for a written constitution in Great Britain, they were actively promoting change in the face of recent elections, which was putting them and their priorities at a clear disadvantage. So they obviously saw the writing of a constitution as a way to rein in the excesses of the conservative majority in Parliament. In this country, we're seeing the same kinds of things happen with the influence of the Koch brothers and the influence of the American Legislative Exchange Council, the efforts to draft model legislation related to right to work, prevailing wage, the Common Core, all of these things. State after state is doing it. What the Supreme Court does at the national level in the way it interprets the law is going to determine whether these efforts to enact ideologically directed legislation continue or whether they will be halted. That's why it seems to me they are so significant. That's one reason why I think the election of 2016 is going to be so significant, because whoever sits in the White House is probably going to oversee the selection of 2 or 3 members of the Supreme Court. And what that can mean for the future of the country, it seems to me, is very significant. We're at 51 minutes after the hour. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left in today's program. I'm a little bit reluctant to take on another issue, but let me at least introduce an idea and give you some preview as to where I'd like us to go tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. Remember, tomorrow is Tuesday, and we will be beginning our program 1/2 hour later than usual. We begin at 1:30 p.m. in the East tomorrow. So our program will be 90 minutes rather than the full 2 hours. I have been absolutely enthralled for the last several hours before the program today with an article that I read in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I wanted to share it with you. My plans, before I ran into this article about the written constitution in Great Britain on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, I had pretty well decided that the direction I'd like to take in today's program would be based on this particular article that appeared in today's Chronicle of Higher Education. I think you will get an idea as to what attracted me about this article by the title. The title of the article is The Attack on Truth. The Attack on Truth. And the subtitle, We Have Entered an Age of Willful Ignorance. We have entered an age of willful ignorance. Clearly, without reading the first word of this article, we can tell from the title that the thrust of this article is to address the very serious question of truth itself. And the chances are that the article is probably going to raise questions such as, is there really such a thing as truth? Were the relativists of the 70s and 80s right when they claimed that there is no such thing as absolute truth, and that truth must always be seen as relevant, as relative? that circumstances change truth? Circumstances demand certain things. Changed circumstances demand other things. And so consequently, what we call truth has to change accordingly. This was a big debate in the late 20th century. Many of you will recall the very popular book called The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. I think we've made reference to the closing of the American mind here on at the Virtual Center. But the basic argument, the basic idea addressed by Alan Bloom, who passed away in the 90s, I believe, was that we are raising a generation through our schools and colleges of people who are being discouraged discouraged from believing that there is anything like objective truth. That nothing is black or white. That everything is gray. That everything is relative. That in order to determine what the truth is, you have to go into the background. And I just did that with the effort to the written constitution in Great Britain. You can't understand the movement of some to draft a written constitution in Great Britain unless you are aware of the result of the election that just had occurred 2 weeks ago in Britain. And what some of the issues involved in that election were about, like the secession of Scotland from the Empire, from the United Kingdom, the decisions in Great Britain to withdraw from the European Union. That's the political that's the reality. That's what's going on in England. And it's into that context that the effort or the movement to draft a written constitution derives its meaning. So context is important. But is it so important that it denies the reality of objective truth? That there's no such thing as true or false? That it's the circumstances that determine truth from falsehood? I would suggest to you those are the questions that an article entitled "The Attack on Truth" raises. We have entered an age of willful ignorance. Think about that. The implication of that subtitle, willful ignorance, means that people choose to remain ignorant, to not know truth, or worse, to deny truth because it contradicts what they believe. Willful ignorance. Not ignorance from not knowing. Willful ignorance is the ignorance of consciously deciding to not know, to not want to know, to not want to have to deal with evidence that contradicts what you believe. The world as you choose to understand it, your world, your perfect world, is perfect because everything about it makes sense to you. You understand why things happen the way they happen. You have worked out your worldview, and you don't want anything to interrupt it. the topic and the implications of this topic, it seems to me, are incredible. We will be into that in tomorrow's program. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's edition of the Virtual Center. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow at 1/2 hour later for our start. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful evening. Please be safe, and thank you.